I want to start this deep dive right in the middle of it all. I mean, the aftermath, really. Our source material today, it's an analysis by Farzaneh Roostaee, and she opens with this video. It's coming out of Karaj in Iran,
Hmm.
and it's a mother. She's just received the body of her child, and she's just screaming.
It is a harrowing place to start. I mean, Roostaee describes it as a sound rising from the, quote, depths of her soul.
Wow.
It sets a very specific tone for what we're about to get into. We're not just talking about, nuclear treaties or oil prices today.
Yeah.
We are talking about a moment of just profound national trauma.
That's the thing that hit me right away reading this. Roostaee frames the entire situation in Iran as a crossroads, but it's not some hopeful crossroads. It feels desperate.
It does.
The whole premise is that the Islamic Republic is, maybe crumbling, but the world, and specifically the West, is just paralyzed. And not by the regime's strength, but by the fear of what comes next. What happens if it actually falls?
And that's the central tension right there. She calls it the dilemma of the monster versus the vacuum.
The monster versus the vacuum. It sounds like a bad horror movie, but when you think about it in foreign policy terms, it's actually terrifying.
It really is.
So today we're going to unpack exactly what that means. We'll get into the Trump factor. And Roostaee has this really unique, almost biological take on him. And then finally we'll look at why the collapse of this regime is being compared to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
And more importantly, why that comparison has Iran's neighbors, well, absolutely shaking in their boots.
Yeah, it's like a domino theory for the modern Middle East. But before we get to all the high-level geopolitics, we have to understand the mood on the ground. The source describes a nation in what she calls a semi-shutdown. Let's dig into that. Semi-shutdown. I mean, yeah, it sounds like more than just a strike. What is daily life actually like?
It's described as the state of suspended animation. Roostaee says the population is depressed, they're traumatized, people are just glued to their phones, doom scrolling, basically.
Just waiting.
Just waiting to see if the regime falls or if the crackdown gets even worse. It's a psychological paralysis. You go to work, you buy your bread, but your mind is constantly on this huge historical shift that feels like it's about to happen.
The analysis mentions that people are shocked by the brutality. But, to play devil's advocate for a second, hasn't this regime always been repressive? We've seen crackdowns before.
Yeah.
What makes this moment feel so different to the people on the ground?
And that's a fair question. I think the difference, according to Roostaee, is the scale of it and the brazenness. She points out that even the most cynical Iranians are shocked that the supreme leader, Khamenei, has revealed himself to be what she calls a bloody criminal so openly.
So there was this idea that there were some lines they just wouldn't cross.
A lingering belief, maybe a naive one, yeah. She argues those lines have they've been obliterated.
And one of the specific claims she makes about crossing that line, it involves who is actually doing the shooting. She talks about foreign mercenaries and rabid dogs.
Yes, and this is a really critical detail. The claim is that the regime has had to bring in proxy fighters, militiamen from Iraq, from Syria, to suppress the protests.
Just so we're clear, for anyone who doesn't follow the region super closely, when we say proxies, we're talking about groups the Iranian regime usually pays to fight for them outside their borders, right?
Exactly. Usually, Iran exports these fighters to influence wars in, say, Syria or Iraq. But Roostaee is saying they've had to import them back home to shoot their own people.
Which implies something huge.
It does.
It implies they don't trust their own Iranian security forces to pull the trigger anymore.
Precisely. I mean, if you have to bring in foreigners to shoot your own citizens, you're acting less like a government and more like an occupying force. The source describes people walking in Tehran, just looking at the pavement, knowing that blood was spilled right there. It creates this atmosphere of pure hatred, but also, intense caution.
So the internal pressure is at a boiling point.
Yeah.
And naturally, everyone's looking outside for help. And that brings up the Trump factor. Now, normally when we talk about Trump and Iran, it's all sanctions, maximum pressure. But Roostaee takes this detour into genealogy.
She does. It's a fascinating, if maybe unconventional, bit of analysis. She brings up Trump's grandfather.
The one who ran the boarding houses back in the gold rush.
That's the one. The grandfather who ran places that offered liquor, gambling, whatever made money. And the source uses this to argue that a transactional nature is literally in his DNA.
Right.
And she isn't just being colorful here. She's making a very specific point to the Iranian opposition. Do not look at this man as a moral crusader.
So the message is, he's not coming to save you because he hates evil. He's a businessman. He just wants to close the deal.
Exactly. He wants to solve the case. And based on this profile of Trump as the ultimate pragmatist, Roostaee lays out 3 very specific scenarios for how the U.S. might handle this whole crisis.
Okay, let's run through them because they range from, cautiously optimistic to,
Yeah.
well, an absolute nightmare for the people protesting.
Scenario 1 is what you could call maximum pressure for a maximum deal. This is where Trump squeezes the regime so hard economically, diplomatically, that they just have to fold. Give him everything he wants.
It's the I won, I fixed it, look at me scenario.
Right, a total capitulation that he can brand as his own personal victory.
Okay, what's 2?
Scenario 2 is limited escalation. This one's messier. It's a mix of targeted military strikes, maybe hitting some of those proxy bases we mentioned, ramping up support for Israel. It's aggression, but it stops short of a full-scale war.
And then there's the third one. The one the source seems to think is the biggest risk.
The bad deal. This is the scenario where Trump strikes a really narrow agreement, probably focused only on the nuclear issue. He gets to go on TV, shake hands, and say, I stopped the Iranian bomb.
But the regime stays in power.
The regime stays. The mullahs stay. And all the human rights abuses, the screaming mothers we started with, they just get ignored because they aren't part of the deal.
So in that version, the West gets security from a nuclear Iran, but the Iranian people are left locked inside the house with the monster.
That is the absolute fear. And Roostaee suggests the regime is desperately trying to steer things toward exactly that outcome. They're trying to signal, hey, we can talk, They just want to freeze the situation so they can survive.
Which leads to a really obvious question. If the people want the regime gone, and there's this risk of a bad deal, then who is advocating for the people? The source spends a lot of time on Prince Reza Pahlavi, son of the last Shah.
She does, and she's quick to clarify that she is not a monarchist herself, but she gives credit where it's due. She calls his mobilization efforts a masterpiece.
A masterpiece.
Yeah, she argues he's managed to unite the diaspora and the people inside Iran in a way that, well, no other opposition figure has been able to do.
But there's a disconnect, right?
Yeah.
If he's mobilizing millions, if he's the voice of this movement, why aren't we seeing the big photo ops? Why isn't he shaking hands with the Secretary of State on the front page?
That is the million-dollar question. And Roostaee suggests it is not an accident. She points to a couple of things. First, she calls it the lobby.
When she says lobby, does she mean formal, K Street lobbyists?
Not exactly. It's more a network of influence, academics, media figures, policy experts in the U.S. who've spent years arguing that the Islamic Republic is stable, or at least better than the alternative.
Oh.
She argues these voices are still whispering in the ears of the White House, painting the opposition as fragmented or too risky.
In the second reason.
The second reason brings us right back to our title, the monster versus the vacuum. The West is terrified of an uncontrolled collapse.
This is a controlled demolition theory she talks about.
Exactly. I mean, think about it like a structural engineer in a crowded city. You've got this rotting building. You know it has to come down.
Right.
But you don't just put dynamite under it and blow it up because the debris would take out everything around it. You want a controlled demolition. You want it to fall neatly into its own footprint.
And right now, the West doesn't see a demolition crew that they trust to do that.
That's the argument. Roostaee says that Western powers look at Iran and they don't see a government in waiting that's ready to take the keys on day one. They just see a potential black hole.
Okay, let's really get into this monster versus vacuum idea, because she says this is the fundamental calculation the West is making. Why is the vacuum so much scarier than the monster? I mean, the monster is killing people right now.
It's the brutal calculus of foreign policy. The monster, the current regime, is horrific. It kills its own people, but it has a phone number.
Phone number.
It controls the borders. It manages the oil flow. It secures the weapon depots. There's a structure there you can negotiate with or sanction or threaten.
And the vacuum.
The vacuum is Syria in 2012. The vacuum is Libya after Gaddafi. It's a power void where suddenly nobody is guarding the chemical weapons. Warlords take over. ISIS takes over. To a cold, calculated strategist in Washington or London, a vacuum is infinitely worse than a monster because it's completely unpredictable.
That is incredibly bleak. It basically means the West's default position is to prop up a dictator rather than risk anarchy.
Unless, and this is the key part, unless they are convinced there is a viable alternative that can prevent that vacuum. And that's why this slow walk on acknowledging the opposition matters so much. They aren't sure yet if the opposition can hold the building up if the foundation cracks.
And it's not just the U.S. making this calculation. The source brings in the Berlin Wall comparison.
Mm.
And, normally when we talk about the Berlin Wall falling, it's a happy story.
Mm-hmm.
David Hasselhoff singing freedom, all of that. But Roostaee says Iran's neighbors are looking at a potential Berlin Wall moment in Tehran with absolute terror.
Yes, this is the geopolitical nightmare part of our deep dive. She draws a direct line between the fall of the wall in '89 and the potential fall of this regime. When the wall fell, it wasn't just one event, it triggered a cascade.
Right.
Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, regimes just toppled one after another like dominoes.
So if Tehran falls, who's the next domino? Who is so scared?
She specifically points to Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And what's really interesting is that they're scared for very different reasons.
Let's start with Turkey. I'll be honest, I didn't quite get this at first. Turkey is in NATO, huge economy, they have elections. Why would Erdogan care if Iran's government changes?
It's about the kind of change. Erdogan runs a government that is rooted in political Islam, and Roostaee argues that if a neighboring Islamist regime, even a rival one like Iran, collapses and gets replaced by a secular democratic government, well, that sends a massive ideological shockwave.
Oh, I see. So it's not about borders, it's about ideas.
Exactly. If Iran becomes a secular democracy, it challenges the very foundation of political Islam in the whole region. Erdogan fears a secular wave coming across the border that could energize his own opposition in Turkey.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about Saudi Arabia? They've been arch rivals with Iran for decades, proxy wars in Yemen everywhere. You'd think the Saudis would be throwing a party if the regime in Tehran collapsed.
You would think so, but this is where Roostaee brings in a really telling detail from the Green Movement back in 2009.
Just to pause, the Green Movement was the big uprising, right? The "Where is my vote" protests.
Correct. A massive moment of unrest. And Roostaee says that back then, the Saudis were reportedly sending messages to the U.S. and other allies saying, slow down.
Slow down. Why on earth?
Because monarchies hate revolutions, even if it's happening to their enemy. If Iranians overthrow a dictator and establish a free democracy, the people in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and Jordan, they might start looking around and asking, why not us?
So they want a weak Iran, but not necessarily a democratic Iran.
Exactly. They fear the contagion of democracy. They can't control the speed of that kind of change. They prefer the status quo where they know the rules of the game rather than a revolutionary wave that could, destabilize their own thrones.
That's just such a cynical
Right.
but clear way of looking at the region. It's about stability, not freedom.
And that's before you even get to the immediate chaos. Roostaee lists the practical fears. An energy crisis if oil stops flowing. A massive wave of millions of refugees pouring into Turkey and Europe.
And she calls it the regime turning the country into a pump for terrorism.
Right. Just exporting chaos to punish the world for letting them fall. So when you combine the monster versus vacuum fear in the West with the Berlin Wall domino fear in the region, you get why the world powers are treading so carefully. They are walking on eggshells around a volcano.
So where does that leave the people? We started with the screaming mother in Courage. We've gone through this whole geopolitical chess game where it seems like every major power is betting against her, or at least they're afraid to help her. Is the conclusion just hopelessness?
No, and this is important. She doesn't say it's hopeless. She believes the regime must go and that it eventually will go. But she argues that real regime change only happens when two specific pressures meet at the same time.
What's the formula?
Internal pressure plus external pressure.
Okay, let's break that down.
If you only have internal pressure people on the streets, the regime just shoots them. We're seeing that right now with those mercenaries. They can crush internal dissent if they have the resources.
And if you only have the external pressure?
If you only have sanctions and isolation, the regime makes a deal. They trade away their nuclear program to get the sanctions lifted, and the people get ignored again.
So you need the clamp. You need the people rising up at the exact same moment the world is squeezing the regime's throat.
That's it. She says when those two forces synchronize, that is when the regime cracks. That's when security forces start to defect because they finally see the end is inevitable. That's when the controlled demolition becomes possible.
But getting that timing right, that seems incredibly hard to orchestrate.
It's excruciatingly difficult. And that is why she ends her whole analysis on this concept of strategic patience.
Strategic patience. That is a tough sell when you're living in that semi-shutdown state we talked about.
A very hard sell. But her argument is that despair is the enemy. She talks about managing the collective psychology of the nation. If the people give up because change isn't happening today, the monster wins. But if they rush blindly without external support, they get slaughtered. They have to hold the line until the external pressure aligns with their movement.
It's a really sobering analysis. It takes all the emotion of the streets and just layers it with the cold, hard reality of international relations.
And it forces us, to look at this whole situation without illusions. The West isn't coming to save Iran because it's the right thing to do. They will act only when the cost keeping the monster becomes higher than the fear of the vacuum.
That's the key takeaway, isn't it? The calculation has to flip.
It has to. And Roostaee seems to believe we're getting close to that point, that the regime is weaker than it looks and the monster is running out of tricks. But we're not there yet.
Before we wrap this up, I want to circle back to that image of the Berlin Wall. It's such a powerful visual. We usually think of maps as these, static, permanent things. But Roostaee is reminding us that maps are drawn in pencil, not ink.
That is a beautiful way to put it. The map of the Middle East has looked a certain way for decades now. We just assume the Islamic Republic is a permanent fixture. But, in 1988, the Soviet Union looked like a permanent fixture.
Right.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union was gone.
And the world changed overnight.
The world changed. Roostaee is telling us that the screams of that mother in Karaj, those are the cracks in the wall. The question now is, when the wall finally falls, is the world ready to catch the bricks?
That is the question that the Iranian people, the opposition, and the world powers are all trying to answer right now. And the answer will determine whether we get a free Iran or a region thrown into chaos.
It's a high-stakes game, and millions of lives are on the line.
Thank you for walking us through this deep dive. It's heavy material, and frankly, a bit depressing at points, but understanding that monster versus vacuum dynamic really does clarify why we're seeing these headlines, or the lack of them.
It was my pleasure. It is a story that is still being written, and we all need to be paying attention.
Absolutely. And to our listener, thank you for joining us. We'll leave you with that thought: the cost of stability versus the price of freedom. Until next time.